Caleb Rourke stood chained to the post in the center of town, with his wrists bound so high his shoulders burned and his boots barely touched the dirt, the iron biting into skin that had never known softness, his small frame swallowed by the weight of humiliation more than pain, as people gathered not to help, but to stare, whisper, and decide what kind of man deserved to be displayed like a warning. He was called the tiny cowboy, with laughter sharp enough to draw blood, mocked for the narrowness of his shoulders and the way his coat hung loose on him, accused of things no one had bothered to prove because it was easier to punish a man who looked easy to break. He had been told to confess, told to beg, told to admit fault for crimes that shifted with every retelling. And when he refused to lie just to end it, the chains went up instead, the message clear enough without words. Silence would not save him, but neither would truth. The sun beat down mercilessly as the crowd swelled, boots scraping, voices rising and falling like a tide that enjoyed the sound of its own cruelty. And Caleb fixed his eyes on the dust near his feet, because looking at them only made it harder to breathe. He had survived hunger, isolation, and winters alone on bad land. But this was different, because this was public, because this was meant to teach him his place. Then the crowd shifted in a way that felt wrong, not louder, but tighter, as if something heavy had entered the space without asking permission, and Caleb felt it before he saw it. The sudden hesitation, the subtle step back, the way laughter thinned into uncertain murmurs. When he lifted his head, he saw her moving forward through the people with a steadiness that cut straight through the noise. A tall mountain widow dressed in dark wool, her posture unbent by grief or fear, her eyes fixed not on the crowd, but on him. She did not hurry, and she did not raise her voice, yet each step she took pulled attention toward her as if the ground itself made room. And Caleb felt something twist painfully in his chest because no one had ever walked toward him like that before, not to defend him, not to claim him, not to risk standing where judgment had already decided. Someone muttered her name in a tone that carried warning. Someone else reached out as if to stop her, but she did not slow. And when she reached the post, she did not look at the chains first, or the men who had fastened them. She looked directly at Caleb, as though the rest of the world had already lost relevance. "Who decided this?" she asked quietly, and the question landed harder than shouting ever could. Caleb swallowed, his throat raw, and for the first time since the chains closed around his wrists, he felt something unfamiliar rise beneath the pain. Not hope, not rescue, but the terrifying possibility that someone was about to challenge the story being written over his life, and that once spoken aloud, nothing in that town would ever be the same again. The widow did not wait for an answer, and that refusal unsettled the crowd more than any accusation could have, because it shifted the balance from spectacle to scrutiny, and Caleb felt it immediately in the way the air changed around the post, the murmurs thinning as if people were suddenly aware of their own voices for the first time. She stepped closer until she stood within arm's reach of him, close enough that he could smell pine smoke on her coat and see the pale scar that traced her jaw, a mark of a life that had not spared her simply because she carried herself with strength. "I asked who decided this," she said again, still quiet, and the quiet demanded an answer. A man near the front cleared his throat and gestured vaguely toward the store steps. "It was agreed," he said, the word chosen carefully to avoid responsibility. The widow's eyes flicked to him, sharp and assessing. "Agreed by whom?" The man hesitated, then looked away, and the pause stretched long enough to expose the truth beneath it, that no single person had decided, that the chain had been fastened by many hands hoping to disappear into the crowd. Caleb watched her face as she listened, waiting for anger that never came, waiting for shouting that did not arrive, and when she finally spoke again, It was to Caleb alone. "Do you know what they accuse you of?" He swallowed and nodded once. "It changes," he said hoarsely. "Depends who's telling it." She held his gaze without pity. "And what is true?" The question struck him harder than the chain ever had, because it asked for something no one else had wanted: his account. "I didn't steal," he said, voice shaking but steadying as the words found their place. "I didn't threaten anyone. I fixed a fence and asked to be paid what I was promised." A ripple passed through the crowd, not agreement but discomfort, the kind that comes when a simple truth refuses to stay buried. The widow turned back to the people then, her posture unchanged, her voice still measured. "If that is a crime," she said, "then you should chain every man here who has ever asked to be paid for his work." Someone laughed nervously. Another shifted his weight, and the sound of the chain creaking as Caleb adjusted his stance cut through the noise like a reminder of what was at stake. "He's small," a voice called out from somewhere behind, defensive and sharp. "That don't mean innocent." The widow inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the thought without accepting it. "No," she replied. "It means convenient." The word landed with a dull finality that left no room to hide, and Caleb felt his chest tighten as the crowd absorbed it, each person forced to recognize the shape of what they had done. She stepped back half a pace, enough to take in the whole scene: the post, the chain, the men who stood nearest with folded arms. And then she made a choice that no one expected, placing her gloved hand lightly against the iron at his wrist. "If you intend to keep him here," she said calmly, "you will need to explain it to me." And in that moment, as the town found itself facing a woman who would not raise her voice and would not look away, Caleb understood that the chains had not yet been removed, but the story that held them in place had begun to crack. Caleb felt the change before it showed on anyone's face, the subtle shift that came when people realized they were no longer watching a punishment, but standing inside a question. And as the widow's hand rested against the iron at his wrist, the chain seemed suddenly louder, its scrape against the post a reminder that whatever happened next would be seen and remembered. She withdrew her hand and turned slightly so the crowd could see her profile, the line of her jaw firm, her shoulders squared, as if she had decided something inwardly and was now prepared to stand with it. "Who hired him to fix the fence?" she asked, and the question cut through the murmurs with unsettling clarity because it was specific, because it demanded a name. A man near the feed store shifted and cleared his throat, eyes darting to the ground. "I did," he admitted reluctantly. "He said he'd finish before sundown. He did." The widow nodded once. "And you paid him?" The man's silence stretched long enough to expose its shape. "Not yet," he muttered. A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd, a few heads turning as if the ground had tilted under their feet. "So he asked for what he was owed," the widow continued evenly, "and this," she gestured to the chain, "was the answer." The man bristled. "He got loud," he said defensively, "made a scene." Caleb's throat tightened, the old instinct to shrink threatening to pull him under. But before he could speak, the widow lifted her hand slightly, not silencing him, but pausing the spiral. "Did he threaten you?" she asked. "No." "Did he strike you?" "No." "Then what crime did he commit?" The man's mouth opened and closed without sound, and in that hollow moment the crowd began to understand the shape of the debt they had ignored, how easily a man's labor could be taken, and his protest turned into spectacle when he was small enough to be dismissed. The widow turned to Caleb again, her gaze steady. "How long did the work take?" 3 days, he answered, surprised at how clear his voice sounded now. "And how long have you been chained?" "Since morning." A murmur rose, sharper this time, edged with something like shame. The widow faced the town fully. "You have chained a man for asking to be paid," she said quietly. "And you have called it justice." No one answered her, because there was nothing left to say that did not reveal intent, and Caleb felt a strange loosening in his chest as he realized the story had shifted again, no longer about his size or his silence, but about a debt the town had tried to forget. She stepped back from the post and folded her hands calmly at her waist. "Decide what kind of place this is," she said, not as a threat, but as an invitation that carried weight. "A place that settles debts with iron, or a place that settles them with truth?" The words hung in the open air, and for the first time since the chain closed around his wrists, Caleb sensed that the town was no longer deciding what would happen to him, but what would happen to itself if it chose to look away now. The pause that followed her words stretched long enough to make the crowd uneasy, and Caleb felt the weight of every second in the tight pull of the chains at his wrists, as if time itself were testing who would move first, because moments like this never stayed still for long. They either broke forward into violence or settled into something quieter and harder to undo. A man near the post shifted and scoffed, trying to recover ground with sound. "You don't live here," he said to the widow, his voice edged with warning. "You don't get to tell us how we handle our own." She turned to him slowly, her expression unchanged, and when she spoke, her voice carried no heat, only certainty. "I live where the truth follows me," she replied, "and it followed me here." The simple statement stripped the challenge of its force, and the man looked away as murmurs rippled again, this time not with cruelty, but with doubt. Caleb watched her with a mixture of awe and fear, because he knew too well what happened to people who stood alone in front of a crowd and refused to bend, and part of him wanted to beg her to stop, to step back before the attention turned on her instead. She did not. She moved closer to the post again, placing herself squarely between Caleb and the men who had fastened the chain, her body not blocking him entirely but claiming space that had not been hers a moment before. "If you believe he is guilty," she said, "then you should be able to say of what, and you should be able to say it plainly." Silence answered her, heavier than shouting ever could have been. Somewhere behind the first row, a woman spoke quietly, almost to herself. "He did the work." Another voice followed, then another, small admissions threading through the crowd like cracks in stone. The widow listened without turning, allowing the truth to surface on its own, and Caleb felt his chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope. A man stepped forward at last, one of the ones who had helped raise the chain, his face flushed. "Enough of this," he snapped. "We can't have order if every hired hand starts making demands." The widow met his gaze without blinking. "Order built on silence is not order," she said. "It is fear pretending to be peace." The words landed hard, and Caleb saw something shift behind the man's eyes, not remorse, but calculation, the recognition that the crowd was no longer safely behind him. She turned then and looked directly at the iron ring bolted into the post, studying it as if it were an object that could be questioned just like any other. "Take it down," she said calmly. The command was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a weight that made several people glance instinctively toward the keys hanging at the sheriff's belt. The sheriff hesitated, caught between habit and the sudden clarity of being watched not as authority, but as choice. And in that hesitation, Caleb understood something vital. The widow had not come to rescue him by force. She had come to make everyone see what they were doing. And once seen, it would be far harder to pretend it had never happened. The moment stretched thin as a wire drawn too tight, and Caleb felt the heat of the sun and the ache in his shoulders sharpen together as every eye turned toward the sheriff, whose hand hovered near the keys without quite committing to the motion. The authority he carried suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before, because it was being measured instead of obeyed. The widow did not repeat herself or look at him again. She simply waited, her stillness more unsettling than anger. And in that waiting, the crowd began to understand that whatever happened next would not belong to her alone, but to all of them. A child's voice piped up unexpectedly from the edge of the gathering, small and uncertain. "He fixed our gate," the boy said. "My pa said it was good work." A hush followed, sharper than before, because truth spoken without strategy had a way of cutting through pretense, and the widow inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, as if welcoming the sound without seizing control of it. The sheriff cleared his throat and finally reached for the keys, the metallic jingle ringing louder than it should have as he stepped forward and unlocked the iron cuff with deliberate care, the sound of the chain loosening echoing through the square like a bell that could not be unrung. Caleb gasped as the weight dropped from his wrists, blood rushing painfully back into his hands, and he nearly collapsed before catching himself against the post, the relief so sudden and sharp it left him dizzy. The widow stepped closer then, not to claim credit but to steady him with a light touch at his elbow, until he found his balance, her hand warm and grounding where the iron had been cold. No one cheered, no one shouted victory, and that silence felt right somehow, because this was not a spectacle meant to entertain, but a correction that demanded reflection. The man who had hired Caleb stood rigid nearby, eyes fixed on the ground, and when the widow turned toward him, her voice was quiet but unyielding. "Pay him," she said. The man hesitated only a second before reaching into his pocket and counting out the money with clumsy fingers, holding it out without meeting Caleb's gaze. Caleb took it slowly, the coins heavier than they should have been, not because of their worth, but because of what it had cost to ask for them. The widow watched the exchange with calm attention, then stepped back, giving Caleb space as if returning ownership of the moment to him alone. "You're free to go," the sheriff said awkwardly, the words sounding strange in his mouth now that freedom had been witnessed rather than assumed. Caleb flexed his hands, feeling the ache settle into something manageable, and for the first time since the chains closed around his wrists, he felt tall enough to breathe fully. He looked at the widow then, wanting to speak, wanting to thank her, wanting to ask why she had chosen to stand where others had stepped aside. But the words tangled in his throat as the crowd began to thin, leaving behind not celebration, but an uneasy quiet that felt like the beginning of reckoning rather than its end. Caleb stepped away from the post with unsteady legs, the space around him suddenly too wide, now that the iron no longer defined where he was allowed to stand, and the crowd that had once pressed close began to dissolve into small, uncomfortable clusters as people remembered errands they needed to run and doors they needed to close, leaving behind the echo of what they had witnessed and would now have to carry home with them. The widow did not hurry him or guide him, allowing him to discover the shape of his own movement again, and as he tested his hands and rolled his shoulders to ease the lingering pain, he became acutely aware of how strange it felt to be looked at without judgment for the first time since morning. A few people avoided his eyes entirely. Others offered quick, uncertain nods that carried apology without courage, and one older man paused long enough to say quietly, "You didn't deserve that," before moving on, as if afraid the words might tether him to responsibility. Caleb stood there absorbing it all, the truth settling in that freedom did not arrive as relief alone, but as a complicated weight made heavier by memory. The widow remained nearby, not hovering, simply present. And when she spoke, it was not to direct him, but to name what he was already feeling. "It will take time," she said softly. "Iron leaves marks that don't always show." Caleb nodded, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice when he answered, "I don't know where to go." The admission felt dangerous, yet honest in a way he had never been allowed to be before. She considered him for a moment, then gestured toward the edge of town, where the road bent toward the foothills. "Walk until the noise fades," she said. "Then decide." The simplicity of the advice steadied him more than sympathy ever could have. As he turned to leave, the man who had hired him finally looked up, shame flickering across his face as he spoke in a low rush. "I didn't think it would go that far." Caleb paused and met his gaze, the anger he expected to feel replaced instead by a clear, unyielding resolve. "It always does," he replied quietly, and continued on without waiting for an answer. The road welcomed him with dust and sun, and the honest ache of movement, and with each step he felt the town loosen its grip just a little more. When he reached the rise beyond the last building, he stopped and looked back once, not to plead or curse, but to acknowledge that what had happened would live there long after he was gone. The widow had not followed him, yet he felt her presence all the same in the knowledge that someone had stood when it mattered. And as he turned forward again, Caleb realized that freedom, even when it arrived late, was not something given. It was something he would now have to learn how to carry on his own terms. The road beyond town curved gently toward the foothills, and with every step Caleb felt the last echoes of the square fall away behind him, replaced by the steady rhythm of his own breathing and the honest weight of a body finally allowed to move without permission. Yet freedom did not quiet his thoughts as quickly as he had hoped, because being released did not erase what had been done or the knowledge that it could happen again to someone else just as easily. He stopped near a stand of cottonwoods where the wind threaded softly through bare branches and rested his hands against the rough bark, grounding himself in something that did not judge or measure him. And as the ache in his shoulders settled into a dull throb, he became aware of how much strength it had taken simply to remain standing at the post without begging to be believed. He thought of the widow then, of the way she had stepped forward without asking who would stand with her, and he realized that her courage had not come from certainty of victory, but from refusal to accept a lie once she saw it clearly. When he resumed walking, the land opened wider, the path narrowing into something more personal, less traveled, and he followed it without urgency, allowing his pace to be set by his own will for the first time in longer than he could remember. As the sun leaned toward afternoon, he reached a low rise where the view stretched back toward town. And from there he saw the widow at last, not close enough to speak, but close enough to know she had followed at a distance, respecting his need for space while refusing to vanish entirely from the story she had entered. She stopped where the road split and waited, hands folded loosely at her sides, her posture calm and unassuming. And in that quiet gesture, Caleb felt something settle that had been restless inside him since the chains fell away. He walked back toward her then, not because he was lost, but because he recognized the difference between solitude and isolation. And when he reached her, he did not speak at first, unsure how to give voice to the gratitude and the questions tangled together in his chest. "You didn't have to come," he said finally. She inclined her head slightly. "I wanted to see where you chose to stand," she replied. The words felt neither intrusive nor expectant, simply offered, and Caleb understood that the strength she carried was not about leading or rescuing, but about witnessing without control. As they stood together at the fork in the road, the town no longer visible and the future not yet defined, Caleb felt the quiet certainty that what had begun at the post was not finished, not because he owed her anything, but because sometimes strength took root in shared ground before growing outward on its own. And he was finally ready to decide what kind of man he would become, now that the world had failed to decide it for him. They stood at the fork longer than either of them expected, the wind moving softly through the cottonwoods as if giving them time to understand the weight of what had already passed. And Caleb realized that the unease he felt was not fear of what lay ahead, but the unfamiliar responsibility of deciding for himself without being pushed by hunger, accusation, or shame. The widow turned slightly toward the narrower path that climbed into the hills, then back toward the road that led away from town, and she did not point or suggest, only let the choices exist openly between them. "When they chained you," she said quietly, "they wanted you small enough to disappear afterward." Caleb nodded, the memory tightening his chest. "I almost did," he admitted. "Not in my body, in my head." She studied him with a look that held no judgment. "Then don't give them that," she replied. The simplicity of the advice struck him harder than anything shouted in the square ever had, because it placed the last piece of control squarely in his hands. He thought of the faces in the crowd, of the way some had looked away while others leaned closer, and he understood that carrying anger would only keep him tethered to them longer than he wished to be. "I don't want to live angry," he said slowly, "but I don't want to forget either." The widow inclined her head in approval. "You don't have to," she said. "Memory can be a boundary instead of a wound." The idea felt strange but steady, and as Caleb let it settle, he felt his breathing ease in a way it hadn't since morning. He glanced up the hillside path again, noticing how it narrowed just enough to require intention. And without fully realizing it, he took a step in that direction, then another. The choice forming through movement rather than declaration. The widow remained where she was, watching without following, and Caleb paused and looked back at her, understanding suddenly that she had never meant to guide him beyond the moment where he could guide himself. "Will you go back?" he asked. She considered the question before answering. "Yes," she said. "There are still people there who need to remember what they saw." The words carried weight, and Caleb felt a surge of respect deepen into something firmer. "Then I'll carry this forward," he replied, touching his chest lightly where the truth now lived. They shared a final moment of quiet recognition, not as rescuer and rescued, not as owed and owing, but as two people who had stood in the open when it mattered. And as Caleb turned and began the climb into the hills, the ache in his shoulders no longer felt like weakness, but like proof of what he had survived. And the strength he carried now felt earned, not because someone had freed him, but because he had chosen what part of the truth would follow him into the rest of his life. Caleb climbed until the sounds of the road faded completely, until the wind through scrub and stone replaced the echoes of voices that had once measured his worth aloud, and with every step upward the town loosened its hold on him. Yet it did not vanish from his thoughts as easily as distance might suggest, because some places follow you not in geography but in memory, demanding to be understood before they can be released. He paused near a rocky shelf, where the land opened into wide silence, and sat there for a long while, flexing his hands and watching the light shift across the valley below. And as the ache in his shoulders softened, he realized that what lingered most sharply was not the chain or the crowd, but the moment when the widow had asked who decided his punishment, forcing the town to see itself instead of him. Far below, he could imagine the square now, people returning to routines, doors opening, conversations resuming with forced normalcy, and he knew that beneath that surface something had cracked that would not mend cleanly, because once injustice was named aloud, it rarely stayed contained. He understood then that his leaving was not escape but completion, the final step of a moment that belonged as much to the town as it did to him, and that staying would have allowed the story to continue shaping him instead of the other way around. As the afternoon wore on, he rose and continued forward, the path narrowing into rugged terrain that demanded attention and care, and in that effort he found a steady peace that did not require approval or explanation. He thought again of the widow returning alone to the road, of the way she would walk back through town with the same quiet certainty she had carried to the post. And he felt no fear for her, only respect, because he knew now that people who spoke truth calmly often unsettled a place longer than those who shouted. When the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across the hills, Caleb reached a place where he could no longer see the town at all, and the absence felt right. Not because he wished it erased, but because he no longer needed to look back to know what he carried with him. The lesson had already taken root, that dignity did not come from size or approval, and that silence could be strength when it was chosen instead of enforced. As he moved on beneath the lengthening sky, Caleb felt the strange, grounding certainty that the town would remember the day a small cowboy had been chained in public, and a woman had stepped forward to ask why, and that even if the memory faded for some, it would remain sharp and unyielding for him, not as a wound, but as a line he would never again allow anyone to cross without answering. By the time the sun slipped behind the far ridge, Caleb had walked far enough that the land no longer felt like something he was passing through, but something that had begun to accept him on its own terms. The path beneath his boots rough and honest, demanding attention without judgment. And as the first stars edged into the sky, he understood with quiet certainty that the hardest part of what he had endured was not the chain itself, but the moment it had been fastened, while others watched and chose not to see him. He stopped near a stand of juniper and built a small fire, not to announce his presence, but to mark it. And as the warmth settled into his hands, he reflected on the man he had been before that morning. Careful, quiet, willing to shrink to avoid trouble, and how easily that version of himself might have disappeared entirely if the widow had not stepped forward and refused to let the town decide his worth in silence. Yet even as gratitude surfaced, it did not carry the weight of dependence, because Caleb knew now that what had saved him was not only her courage, but his own refusal to lie when pressed to confess to something he had not done, his own choice to endure without surrendering truth. The realization grounded him more firmly than anger ever could have. Somewhere behind him, the town would continue on, altered in small, uneven ways, some people forgetting, others remembering too clearly, but its future no longer pressed against his chest like a verdict waiting to be delivered. He fed another stick to the fire and watched the sparks lift and vanish into the dark, thinking of the fork in the road, of the moment he had turned back not to be guided but to acknowledge what had been given freely and without condition. And he understood then that dignity was not restored by being defended, but by being recognized and then carried forward by one's own steps. When he lay down beneath the open sky, the pain in his shoulders felt distant now, more memory than threat, and the quiet around him did not feel empty but full, holding the promise of days shaped by labor freely chosen and words spoken only when they mattered. As sleep finally claimed him, Caleb knew that the town had tried to make an example of him by chaining him where everyone could see. But what they had created instead was a man who had learned the exact measure of his own worth. And that knowledge, once earned, could not be taken, mocked, or fastened to a post ever again. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,